Hello, everyone. This is Chrononauts. I'm JM, and I'm here with Nate and Gretchen. And if you want to hear our little history of science fiction film and TV, along with us talking about our interest in Star Trek, tune in to episode 1 of this series. Now we're going to talk about something rather different, Doctor Who. So, we mentioned Doctor Who a lot on this podcast, don't we?
I think so, yeah.
I think it always seems to come up. So finally we're going to talk about it at some length. I'm sure some of our audience knows a little bit about it. The show started in 1963, and the first run of the TV series went up till 1989, had 7 different actors playing the lead role of the Doctor, who's a traveler in time and space, who basically can show up anywhere and anywhen he wants. Now, obviously, just like Star Trek, Doctor Who, although on paper it sounds like a very free thing that could be pretty much anything at all, does tend to follow a formula most of the time. But the interesting thing is to see how that changes from era to era, and the strengths and weaknesses of each era. And fans will talk about this kind of stuff for ages and ages, and never come to an agreement. Maybe sometimes come to blows, but hopefully not. But yeah, it's got a long history. After 1989, obviously, there was some television silence, but various things were happening. I think before we get to that, I guess we'll just talk a little bit about our general experiences like we did with Star Trek, and then I guess we'll get into what sort of happened between 1989 and 2005, because there's quite a story there. But during that time, Doctor Who wasn't on the air, and I'm pretty sure you guys... Well, Gretchen, I know the case is true for you because you weren't born then, but I'm pretty sure it is for Nate, too, the case that you discovered the show after the initial airing was over, right?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up with Doctor Who like I did with Star Trek. I didn't get into Doctor Who until after I graduated college. I had always kind of known it was a thing, and Jam, I remember you talking about really liking it a lot, but I just never caught it on TV, and it was just never syndicated like Star Trek was across like a billion different channels. So I just really never encountered it until one day walking around town. A lot of people have free giveaways of stuff, and there's like a town-wide garage sale and things like that. I saw a copy of the DVD box set, which has the surviving episodes of the Lost serials from the Hartnell and Troughton years. And I was like, cool, this is free, it's stuff from the 60s.
Oh, well, that's an interesting way to start.
Yeah, it is. And I quickly realized that those weren't complete stories. So I was like, all right, I don't know if I want to start with like an incomplete piece just like randomly in the middle.
Did you realize that before you got it?
No, because like I didn't really know anything about the show. I just saw, a Doctor Who box set. It's from the 60s. It's free. I'm just going to grab it. So I did. But then I realized that, they weren't complete stories. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to start at the beginning. I'm going to try to find the first episode and work my way there. And, I quickly encountered the fact that a lot of them were lost, but kind of survive in that the audio exists and there's been a lot of fan recreation, which towards the end of Loose Cannon's run got quite sophisticated as far as how they were able to piece some of the episodes back together with the surviving images. And they do a really good job, I think. So I ended up watching the entire series in order from the first episode to the end of the show in 1989. And definitely enjoyed a lot I'd say, first half. Certainly through the Baker years, I like a lot. Some stories more than others. It definitely gets a little shaky in the latter half of the Baker run. And after that, there's some stories here and there I like, but it's a bit rougher going, especially I think during the Sixth Doctor era for me. And the Seventh Doctor, I think, is kind of unfortunate because I think the show starts to get really good again at the very end, and then it just kind of stops.
And then it finished,
But,
yeah.
That's kind of my experience with Doctor Who. It's definitely something I really like at its best, personally, which for me is like the more science fiction horror type stuff that they do in the Troughton era and some of the early Baker era. I think is just like really, really awesome. But again, I like a lot of the early stuff. Hartnell era and Pertwee era has a lot of really cool stuff to offer too.
Cool. Gretchen, you go next because I think I'll be on for a while.
Yeah, so as I mentioned when we were talking about the Star Trek, how we got into Star Trek, I got into Doctor Who around 2012 when I was like 10, 11. And at the time, I think I had just heard about it like online, and I didn't really know the whole story of like the division between like Classic Who and New Who, the time between those two series. I just caught, I think the first time I watched it was just like some reruns of, at the time it was Matt Smith who was on, and I just caught like a few of the newer episodes that had just come out on BBC America. And I ended up watching all of New Who, which I found like on Netflix at that time before they took it off of Netflix. I watched through the entire series and then went back and watched the classic series, which I did end up liking more than the new series. I still enjoy certain sections of it, but the way I found it was, again, it was just on Netflix, and at the time that was how I got a hold of media. So I believe it was like one Hartnell story, which was the Aztecs, one Troughton story, a couple of Pertwee. There was like maybe a dozen of Tom Baker, and then 2 Peter Davidson, none of Colin Baker. They went right past him. Not one. None of his. And then 1 McCoy era. So that was my first experience with Classic Who, was in that very limited range before I started collecting some DVDs that I would find. And, you know, whenever I would go to like stores that had like any sort of films or TV, I would find certain ones.
Yeah.
And then eventually I found them on Daily Motion and stuff and watched the rest of them there. There are still a couple of the missing episodes that I haven't seen yet. I have not seen the recreations of. Some of the like lesser ones like Space Pirates and stuff like that.
They're not really stories that are discussed very often, so they're generally not at the top of people's lists to watch, but
yeah. I saw quite a few of the ones that, you know, are like the one like Marco Polo and like a lot of the ones that seem very interesting to me.
Yeah.
I mean, the Makra Terror is probably one of my favorite Classic Who stories. I really enjoy the Makra Terror.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And Second Doctor, Third Doctor is definitely the eras that I gravitate the most towards. And it's been a while since I've watched quite a few of those, like a lot of classic and a lot of the New Who episodes back a decade ago is when I first saw them, and there are a number of ones I've obviously watched and rewatched quite a few times, but I'd like to go back and rewatch quite a few of them and maybe do them in order at some point. I have not done that, so that's very cool that you got to watch them in order, Nate.
Yeah, it took like, I think, a year and a half or something like that. But
yeah.
Well, it took me a lot longer, but yeah. Gretchen, was there either new or old Doctor Who? Do you think there was like a single story that you watched that just kind of made you go, oh, I really like this. I want to watch more of this show? For
New Who, it's hard to pinpoint. I did watch the entire series, but I don't really, it's hard to think of the time when I was like, I really liked that specific series. But Classic Who, when I watched the Aztecs and the Mind Robber, those were the 2 that they had chosen for Hartnell and Troughton for Netflix. As soon as I watched those, I was like, I love classic Doctor Who and wanted to watch the rest of the series. Mind Robber, again, is another one of my favorites along with Makra Terror, so.
That one's pretty surreal as well, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nate, have you seen any New Who?
Not really. Like, I've seen a couple episodes here and there, but not a substantial chunk at all.
Mm.
Yeah.
I've seen, there's like a gap during the 12th Doctor that when I had my watching of Doctor Who kind of subsided for a little bit, but I have seen most of New Who even after I first discovered it and then went back to Classic Who, I still kept up to date with New Who. I think it's just like that gap and the last few of the 13th Doctor. I know the 14th Doctor, Ncuti Gatwa, is now on, but I have not seen the last several episodes.
I've certainly seen more stuff starring people who have played the Doctor in New Who and other things. I just watched The Lair of the White Worm, which stars...
Peter Capaldi.
Yeah, that's a fun movie.
Yeah.
that was a lot of fun. Apparently not one of Bram Stoker's best books, but really fun Ken Russell film.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Very
typical Ken Russell, it feels like,
is.
from what I've seen.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. Everybody seems to have their own story of how they got into Doctor Who. And I mean, I guess that's true of Star Trek too, but it just seems like sometimes the Doctor Who ones are a bit wild because, like you said, Nate, it's even during the time when everybody was watching things on television and like PBS and all that, it wasn't syndicated everywhere all the time. And you had to know when and where to catch it. And sometimes it was a little crazy, like... One of the first stations I watched it on was a PBS station out of Buffalo, and they would show the stories in feature-length form every Saturday. But the weird thing about that was because they were feature-length and each serial was, like, they weren't all the same length, right?
Yeah.
So you never knew exactly what time in the afternoon Doctor Who was going to be on, unless you looked in the TV guide, which I couldn't read. So I was like, I'll never know when Doctor Who's on. Luckily, I would ask my mom and she would tell me usually. And a lot of the time I was busy doing stuff on Saturday afternoon. So generally I would miss the first part of the serial when it was on PBS. And this was how I watched a lot of the Tom Baker ones initially and Pertwee. Although I missed the beginning of the Pertwee years. But the first story I ever saw was actually episode 1 of a Peter Davison story called Earthshock. And at this time, I was very, very young. I was still in nursery school, not even in kindergarten yet. I barely watched TV besides, like, Sesame Street. This is how primal and basic it was when I found Doctor Who. I didn't know what science fiction was. I didn't know what, like... I don't know, I guess I had basic concepts like maybe robots and spaceships or whatever, but not even that much. And I was just channel surfing because, we had our TV and with the big dials that you flipped, you just turned the dials and we didn't have cable at that time, I think. So we had like just a few channels, but I mean, I was a kid, so I just liked flicking the dials, and even the white noise was kind of cool. And then I found this show, and I didn't understand what was going on, but it was really scary sounding. And I later found out that, this is the one episode of Doctor Who where it's like, they were totally riffing on Aliens, except Aliens hadn't even been made yet. Because it's like these guys wandering around in a cave with all these detectors and stuff, and there's a couple of androids wandering around that are protecting this hatchway that the Cybermen have used to put a bomb in there that they're going to destroy the Earth with or something, and the androids are supposed to be guarding it, and this archaeological expedition is down there looking for fossils of dinosaurs, and they run afoul of these androids that are just like stalking them through the dark caves, and every so often somebody gets killed and their body gets liquefied, and that's supposed to be like Doctor Who always had a thing where it was always having to deal with people saying it was too violent from time to time. So it was just really funny because you could tell that every now and then somebody would try to push things a little, and that doesn't sound like that much by the standards of like maybe the films that were out in theaters at the time, not Aliens yet, but Alien, for example, but still, certain very frightful images that I guess the BBC watching public thought that their children might be exposed to, especially during that Philip Hinchcliffe era of the Tom Baker years that Nate was talking about with the sci-fi horror stuff.
Yeah. And then they kind of overcorrect it in the other direction and take on this really juvenile, kid-friendly direction for a little while.
Sort of, yeah, and because the producer of that stuff, of the horror stuff, eventually got fired,
right,
for pushing things,
yeah,
too far in some people's estimation.
I mean, even early on in the Hartnell era, like in Dalek's Master Plan, when you see the death of one of the major characters. I'm sure it was kind of shocking when it first aired, especially because the show had a somewhat more juvenile tone at that point, though they hadn't really played up some of the horror elements as much as they would in the Troughton years.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Doctor Who really can be anything. So for like 3 months in 1965, it was this ridiculous, crazy space opera that spanned the entire galaxy. Like, just out of nowhere. And then the next week it was like 15th century France and the Huguenots and the Catholics at each other's throats. And it's like, oh, all of a sudden we're watching like a fairly serious historical drama? What's going on here? If you think about it, especially the Hartnell era, it was really crazy.
Yeah.
It was like all these things back to back, and like it's like they purposefully set out to be like, we don't really know what kind of show we're making, and that's the cool thing about it.
Yeah.
Eventually it definitely settled down. That's both good and bad, I guess, right? Like, the Hartnell years are really interesting, but I guess at times, especially towards the end, that inconsistency of tone and the fact that the lead actor was very clearly on the way out and stuff like that kind of makes it a little difficult sometimes. But yeah, so I basically started with the Davison era, and I guess a lot of people my age who grew up with it at that time remembered that stuff fondly, and I definitely see why he's not a favorite of many, and his era maybe not the strongest, but when it's good, I think that it actually probably is some of the best that Doctor Who has to offer. But it's just not that good all the time.
Right. Yeah, no, there's some definitely really good ones from his era, for sure, especially his last serial.
Oh, yeah. I was about to say, Caves of Androzani is definitely one of the best of the series. I love that one.
I always loved Snake Dance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was always one of my favorite ones. And that one kind of plays a bit on the horror aspect as well. Again, of course, another thing we've talked about before on the podcast is the music. And, how the music was sometimes really effective at conveying an atmosphere. And not just the theme song, but a lot of the incidentals. And in the early 80s, the scores were all electronic. And although Doctor Who wasn't the only show doing that at the time, I think it was particularly a thing on the BBC because they found that the composer could just do the stuff in workshop and you didn't have to hire anybody, no musicians to play anything, right? It was all done on a synthesizer. And it makes sense. But it also gave it this cool futuristic vibe, too. So I think that was also how I first became interested in synthesizer music.
Yeah, certainly the audio production on the earliest episodes, especially at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, is pretty incredible. The tape splicing and all the effects that they did before there were synthesizers and computers and things like that they were able to use later on. It's just pretty fascinating how they put all that stuff together. And the BBC in general was very involved in that kind of far out sound production. Some of the other major radio stations and television stations in Europe, particularly the one out of France and the one out of West Germany, RTF and WDR respectively, had a lot of really out there electronic music from the 1950s and 60s, but to my knowledge never really did anything as far as combining it with science fiction TV or cinema in the way that the BBC did with both Doctor Who and Quatermass, and I guess some of the other stuff that pops up in the late 1970s, though.
Yeah, like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had a pretty memorable electronic score as well. But yeah, I mean, in the 60s and 70s, they were using a small, for the most part, a small orchestra ensemble. But then you'd get these odd stories in the 70s. I think season 8 was entirely composed on one synthesizer. And it's this really, obnoxious, blary, early 70s synth that's both terrible and awesome at the same time. It's really, really prominent in that part of the Pertwee era. And it's just most people hear the music and they're like, oh, that's terrible, turn it off, right? I love that.
I really like how Doctor Who sounds and looks, and it's just, I don't know, that era specifically of 60s and 70s science fiction film and TV, it's just how the production just feels and looks and sounds. I don't know, that's my preferred era of science fiction visual material, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually someone that doesn't catch, scores as they're being played in certain pieces of media, but definitely some of the stuff that's in, classic Who during the 60s, like, stands out so well. Like, thinking of the Makra Terror, that one song that they play in the city throughout, like, that really cheerful jingle that's, like, kind of eerie when you get through the episode. Yeah. Yeah, that was... The Cybermen theme, especially with the Tomb of the Cybermen when they're all emerging, that motif sticks in my head quite a bit.
Yeah, it's really cool. So basically we're talking about something very, very formative to, I guess, my entire experience. So I find it sometimes a little bit hard to look at Doctor Who objectively. And I don't mean that in the general fan sense either. I mean, I'm not going to say I fell out of Doctor Who, but definitely with the new series, I kind of eventually sort of stopped paying attention. And, you know, at first I was really excited about it, and it's cool, but I think, I don't know, like, it's kind of connected too with how it was with me in Star Trek, is that I kind of got fatigued with the franchises, and I think that happened probably longer ago than it did for a lot of people, just because I don't know what it was exactly. I mean, I'm not trying to be like holier than thou or anything like that, but I guess it did start to feel like restrictive, and it started to feel like also, you know, things go in certain directions and you take it so personally. Like, I mean, we've talked about that before, you know, and like the Star Wars fans and stuff. And just like, that's not a way to be. And at the same time, like, if you don't like something, you feel like you have to sit there and justify why you don't like it because you've been a fan for so long. And so I don't want to rain on anybody else's parade. You know, you like the new stuff a lot. That's really cool. I think it has moments that I really thought were cool. And I like the fact that they clearly have a lot more time to do it now because they're not making very much. Like, it's almost like you forget Doctor Who's on for a couple of years and then all of a sudden it's back and you're like, oh yeah, Doctor Who's back. Cool. It's like totally the opposite of the way it was in the beginning. Like, everybody talks about how cheap the show was, but it's not just cheap in terms of budget, of money. It's budget in terms of how much time they had and how much turnover there was. Whereas, like, something has to be in the can like a week before it's transmitted, pretty much, or less. And especially in the Hartnell and Troughton times.
They were doing like an episode a week for like the entire year, more or less.
Yeah.
I mean, those early seasons are enormous.
Mm-hmm.
It's really crazy. And now you're lucky if you get like 10 episodes every 2 years, right? So they put a lot into it now, which is respectable because, I mean, obviously, yeah, it deserves to look good. It deserves to have good performances and everything like that have been rehearsed, and things can be fixed a lot in editing. You got as many takes as you want.
No flies on the camera.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But I don't know. I guess a lot of the time with new shows in general, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not much of a TV person anymore. Not really have been ever, I guess. But there are just certain shows that I liked, and now I guess I just I feel like I don't have the patience to really get into new stuff, and I guess that's kind of sad. But it is what it is sometimes. Sometimes I still try things and like them a lot. So I'm never going to say never, but like the whole getting really into Star Wars again, or getting into Marvel movies and comics, or getting into like, it's not really something that I want to spend time with in the future. So I think for a while I did have, it's weird though, like, because every time I feel that way about Doctor Who, something happens, like I watch an episode or watch a story. And then I was saying to Gretchen a while ago that I think in December, for some reason, is my Doctor Who month. So we haven't done a What You've Been Reading lately on Chrononauts installment, but in December, around the holiday time, I read 3 Doctor Who books, which is more Doctor Who books than I read in years. And one of them was, this one for our podcast. But there was another one that was actually really good and made me question whether I made the best choice for podcast pick. And that's the thing, like, so I guess we might as well talk about it now. When Doctor Who was on air initially, between the 60s and the 80s, there really wasn't original fiction published. In the mid-80s, there were a few kind of standalone books that were published that dealt with the Doctor's companions, but they didn't actually feature the Doctor, and I don't really know that they can be considered Doctor Who books in much stretch of the imagination. Like, there weren't very many, but there was one called Harry Sullivan's War, which was written by Ian Marter, who actually played Harry Sullivan on the television in the early Tom Baker years. And he pretty much wrote Harry into a spy novel. Why not, right? And that's the thing with Harry is like this funny contradictory character because he's all this like, he's obviously the comic relief guy. But if you look at like Ian Marter, who actually wrote a whole bunch of novelizations of Who stories, he always ups the violence and the like gore and everything considerably. Like he really goes over the top. It's like he's trying to see how much he can get away with in a novelization, and it's hilarious. But it's too bad he didn't actually make it to the Wilderness years because I think he could have done some really cool stuff. But the fact is that nobody was publishing original Who fiction at that time. In 1989, the show went off the air, and I agree with Nate, it was just starting to get really good again. I do kind of agree that although I like 2 or 3 stories a lot, the Colin Baker years are not the strongest by a shot on the show, on the initial run at least.
Yeah, I really enjoy Colin Baker, like, especially in, like, Big Finish, what they've done with him. I do have to admit that his actual run on the show is not that great.
Yeah, I think one thing that also works against those episodes is they changed the format to make them hour-long episodes instead of 22 minutes,
45 minutes
or whatever. Yeah. And I don't know, it just kind of makes it a little more tedious to get through.
It's weird it didn't work because that's how TV is now, and that's how the new show is. But and then it was even weirder over here because, I mean, although I did mention the PBS Davison and Colin Baker shows, I didn't see that way. I saw those on another station that showed them episodically. But the thing is, they weren't going to change their format for 1 or 2 seasons just because the BBC said, oh, they're 45 minutes episodes now. So they cut them in half.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, too bad. They're still 25 minutes episodes in Canada. So, yeah. So they didn't even end with proper cliffhangers. They would end with, like, the Doctor and Perry walking out of the TARDIS or something. Right. It was like, oh.
Yeah. I guess the cliffhanger stuff is one thing that this novel does really incorporate from the show, is that there's so many cliffhangers in the chapters as it like switches from perspective to perspective. Kind of much like the show handles its plot and pacing points.
Yeah, except the book is mostly not linear, which I think works well for the most part, but we'll get to it.
Yeah.
So in 1991, Virgin Publishing bought the license to publish Doctor Who books, and this was a new thing. This had never happened before, and I gotta be honest, this was a really exciting time to be a Doctor Who fan, and I couldn't read any of these books for a really long time, and I really wanted to so badly, because that was right at the height of me being into Doctor Who, and I'd actually just started to meet other people who are really into Doctor Who, and that was exciting, so that kind of made it even bigger for me. But it wasn't being made anymore, so all we could do was get together at somebody's house and watch old videos, which we did a lot. But the books and things like audios, which were already around, and I'll talk about that a little more in a bit, but the books mostly featured the Seventh Doctor at this point. A couple years later, they did introduce something called The Missing Adventures. I never liked that title because it sort of implied, I don't know, something negative, but it's just weird, kind of. But they showed up to feature other Doctors and companion pairings, so we're kind of assuming that a lot of the listeners know the basic nature of the show, that travels around in something that looks like a police box and usually has somebody, at least one person, traveling with them. And a lot of the time it's a, I guess, somewhat traditionally attractive woman, but not all the time. Different people have had different views about the companions, but in general, I think people are supposed to think of them as the audience identification figure.
Right.
So more so than the Doctor himself. And that was definitely the case in the very beginning, and it's definitely the case in the new series as well. So that was a really interesting time, also because the motto of Virgin Publishing at that time was stories too big for the small screen. And so what they meant by that was not just spectacle, but they were really going to challenge people's preconceptions about Doctor Who and push the envelope. And while a lot of the books were pretty traditional Doctor Who, really, just kind of longer than the Target novelizations, which I also read a lot of, and which we didn't really get into, but there's really so much to talk about with this subject that, yeah, we could be here all night talking about all the different Target novelizations and stuff. And those were, like the Star Trek ones, just novelizations of the show itself, and that was how I got into a lot of the first and second Doctor stories for the first time, because I didn't think I would get to see them. But that's a different story. But now we're talking about the 1990s, which is, as everybody knows, a time traditionally portrayed as being very angsty and full of, I don't know, new metal and Anne Rice movie adaptations, and I don't know. There's a lot of things you could say about the 90s. And to an extent, the books did follow suit. But I think that the really interesting thing about the books was that, yeah, they did tend to push the envelope more than what Star Trek novels were doing at that time, specifically. And they definitely upped the sex and violence considerably, which did upset a good number of fans. Eventually, they did tone it down a bit, at least in terms of what language they were allowed to use in the books, but they still got away with a fair amount. Some of the... I guess you could argue that because I guess a lot of the writers were themselves fans, and although there were definitely some professional writers on the writing staff, or not really staff, but who contributed to the books at the time, many of them were publishing for the first time. So there could be inconsistency in quality, certainly. The editors at the time, Peter Darville Evans and Rebecca Levine, definitely went out of their way to help their authors along, it sounds like, and they essentially guided the hand of the new adventurers into telling pretty long and involved story arcs, and some of it was pretty epic, and some of it was pretty good. Again, these novels are, I guess, they're linked to somebody else's intellectual property, so people did still have to work within that framework. The Doctor had to be in all the stories. But they even found ways around that, not actually incorporating him directly in all the books, and just sort of talking about him, and having him do things behind the scenes that you didn't actually see. And so the whole point of it was the characters trying to figure out whether this was part of the Doctor's plan or not, because he was never around to tell you. So there are all kinds of those kind of shenanigans going on, and when I finally did start to have the ability to read some of the books, I definitely enjoyed them, but I was a little disappointed that it wasn't, for the most part, quite as boundary pushing and extreme that as the fans who didn't like it said it was. And maybe it's because I had already been reading stuff that was a bit more risky and a bit, I guess, pushy, even in science fiction. Like, I don't think that I'd read too much by him yet, but like I already knew who Harlan Ellison was and stuff like that. I'd read some of those classic stories by Silverberg and him and stuff like that. So, I don't know, I guess, like, the idea of Doctor Who being more sexy and violent and stuff was, like, it didn't really rock my world that much by the time I got to it. But it was still kind of cool. But then something happened in 1996. And you guys know what that was?
You mean the movie?
Yes.
Yeah. So there was a television movie made, Doctor Who, made by Fox in America, and they teamed up with a British writer and some others and got Paul McGann, who was an actor who'd been in a bunch of things, to star in the film. And he played the Doctor, and the movie was set in San Francisco, and it definitely felt different. At the time, I didn't like it. It was the first time I remember being that critical and being like, "Wow, I don't know if I like this." But, I don't know, I think my opinion has softened on it a little bit since then. It's still not great, but it's okay. It's about as, maybe not quite as good as it could have been, but like, in terms of 90s sci-fi TV pilots, I don't think it's that bad. But it was just that. It was a pilot. They were wanting to make more, and they never made beyond the one story. Some script ideas were definitely put forward, but nothing came of it. What did come of it was the BBC suddenly got interested in Doctor Who again, so instead of renewing the license for Virgin, they decided, oh, we have our own publishing arm, so we're going to publish these books ourselves. And so that's what they did after 1996, and now we are transitioning into the 8th Doctor, and there are also, of course, books featuring past Doctors, of which our book today is actually one. And these books, made by the BBC, a lot of the writers were people who had written for the Virgin books, but again, not all of them. There's an interesting variety of faces. It does seem like, in general, one thing to observe is that, and I'm sure people will notice, is that even in the 90s, Doctor Who seems a lot more male-dominated than Star Trek does in terms of, like, the fan writers and the prose writers and stuff like that. I don't really know why that is. Anybody got any theories?
I mean, I was looking through people talking about the Star Trek tie-in novels, and I mean, it is very striking to see just how many of them were written by women, at least in the beginning. It is a majority. I think it's like 60%, maybe 70% of the books were written by women.
Those two anthologies, the New Voyages that Frederick Pohl edited and his publisher put out, were written entirely almost by women.
Mm-hmm.
And the weird thing is, in the Voyages of Imagination book, they don't even talk about that. They just mention all the writers, and I'm just like, oh, they're all women.
Yeah.
It's weird that they missed, I don't know, maybe they did that deliberately, but it didn't say anything about them trying to make a statement with that. It just seems to be the way it turned out, which is even more interesting.
The Boldly Writing book was kind of the same way. I thought I didn't read the entire thing like from beginning to end. I just kind of skimmed through it and looked for the mentions of the Wounded Sky. But yeah, from what I could tell, pretty much a lot of the people involved with the fanzines and the fan fiction that was coming out at the time were overwhelmingly women. And I don't know if Doctor Who really had the same amount of fanzine activity in the 60s. I mean, Doctor Who fandom was kind of like weird in that you had that like initial Dalek Mania craze that produced some odd things like that weird novelty song.
Yeah.
I want to spend my Christmas with a Dalek. Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen like Doctor Who fanzines from the 1960s or 1970s, but I'm sure like they must exist. But I don't know if like they're in the same numbers as the Star Trek ones, which were like a lot of publications.
Yeah, because I've seen, like, I think I remembered seeing when looking through, like, fanzines and stuff. There were a couple of Doctor Who fanzines from, like, the 70s. I don't think I saw much from the 60s.
No.
Just, like, the things that I can think of that were produced in the 60s that were writing were, like, official annuals and stuff, but nothing, like, from fans.
Yeah. It's interesting how that develops,
Well, remember when we were reading back in our fandom episode, and there was some special articles from the British contingent, and they talked about how they wanted to develop their own fandom, but that it wasn't really, it didn't really seem like it was that feasible, and they couldn't even get a sci-fi magazine off the ground. And I just think the climate in Britain was very different, and I don't think that, I don't think there were any fanzines for Who in the 60s. I mean, I guess it could be that, like, a couple of guys did some, like, copied a bunch of stuff and passed it around to their friends, which is ultimately what fandom amounts to sometimes. But it just doesn't seem like there was that much until the early 80s. Like, right at the start of the 80s, it really started to seem to kick off, which is weird because it's also when we associate with, I guess, the time when Doctor Who started going a bit down. In terms of its respectability and ratings, but I don't know. It's the same thing that I noted earlier with the Star Trek stuff. It almost seems like the less people are paying attention to something, the more active the fan community is. And I know that sounds weird.
No, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, because it introduces a demand for it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost, I feel like it could also be, considering the opinions of the later seasons of Doctor Who, if people were unhappy with the quality of that, they might think, well, I'm going to make my own stories, similar to Diane Duane being like, I don't like this book, I can make a better book.
Right.
There's actually a really, I'm not going to say famous because I don't know how many people know it, but I remember coming across a review of it in the local Doctor Who fan club's magazine that I got, and I can't remember the name of the book, but it was essentially a book written by somebody who really didn't like the Seventh Doctor's era and didn't like the books and thought that he was too manipulative and terrible, and basically created this whole scenario around how this alien had basically taken the Doctor's body or something like that, or influenced him to, like, do all this destructive stuff. Or maybe it wasn't an alien, maybe it was like that, even the Sixth Doctor, or what was that, the Valier that put him on trial, and it was actually his future self.
Lord thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so is it basically that, just denying the whole thing, right? So, I don't know. That was definitely a thing sometimes. And, yeah, it just seems like the conventions really took off then too. And what was really interesting in the 80s was that the producer of the show at that time, John Nathan Turner, took an active interest in conventions, and none of the others had done that before. And it was both a good and a bad thing, because apparently he went to the United States a lot, and instead of doing his job on the show, he was hanging out at conventions with his partner and like hanging out with other Doctor Who fans and talking about all the cool shit that he was going to do. And meanwhile, the show increasingly was falling into chaos, especially during the Colin Baker era. So I don't know. It's controversial, complex stuff around a lot of these characters, and outside of the scope of the podcast for sure. But so the BBC books basically carried on with the Eighth Doctor, and I will say that although I haven't read too many of those, I've read a number of the New Adventures, but certainly not all of them. Those are the Virgin books. BBC, I've read fewer, but I started to read more. One of those, that one that I commented on earlier, where I said, yeah, maybe this would be a good choice too. It was actually a really interesting and cool book. Didn't feel at all like traditional Doctor Who, and was a BBC book. So again, although our writer tonight, Jim Mortimore, does say that he felt more restricted under the BBC than he did under Virgin, it does seem like until 2005 at least, the writers still had a good amount of freedom because, there was no Doctor Who on television. Once it came to the television, I think that changed. I read a couple of New Who books, and it definitely seems like the tone has changed a lot. While I won't say that, again, I'm not trying to stress that it's all better in the old days, but it seems like when the fiction's not the priority and the show's the priority, there's only so much the writers can do. You feel that consciously when you're reading it. And you also feel like, I don't know, the type of gravity of storytelling and the language and stuff maybe has been toned down a bit. And again, that might not be true in all cases, but it's the impression that I got. The other side of that is too, though, like with the Star Trek being on television, there comes a certain cachet with it. So during the New Who era, you do get some professional science fiction writers writing Doctor Who again, which didn't happen that much during the Wilderness years. It did happen a very little bit, but not much. So, you get like Michael Moorcock writing one or two Doctor Who novels. Alistair Reynolds wrote a couple. There's a couple more that I'm forgetting, so.
Yeah. I remember back in around the 50th anniversary, they had this like box set of like these short stories, like only 40 to 60 pages. And I think one of them, was it the 11th Doctor one, that was like written by like Neil Gaiman or something. Like, there were a couple other like notable names that they had there that were writing the short stories for that.
Well, he actually wrote an episode of the TV show as well, eh?
Yeah, The Doctor's Wife.
Yeah, that was the only one that he's done so far, I think. But I guess in my dreams, Kenneth Lee would have written a Doctor Who story. That would have been cool. I don't know if she liked it, but I bet she probably did at least a little, being a British writer and everything.
Oh, I feel like she would. I mean, I feel like, especially as a person who obviously enjoyed Blake 7 enough to write for it, I'm sure she enjoyed at least, some of Doctor Who. Probably some of the more horror-oriented ones from the Fourth Doctor era.
And the thing is, like, at times Doctor Who does have a reputation for being a little bit more for younger adults, right? Like, not necessarily... Again, like, that's a tricky thing to talk about, because I'm not necessarily going to say that I think Star Trek is more mature than the Doctor Who, because, I don't know, I don't often think that's the case, but sometimes maybe. It doesn't matter, really. The point is telling a good story, but...
It really all depends on the serial, I think. I mean, sometimes Doctor Who will just throw you into the middle of some, like, political drama in the far future or whatever that, whereas other times you get... canine and other wacky like
I don't know. It's part of that crazy tonal shift that we were talking about, right? Where it's like you just sometimes don't know what to expect from one week to the next, and that's not only like what kind of story, but the quality of things like the visual effects, right? It's really funny because the podcast that I like that I mentioned before on the show, Watchers in the Fourth Dimension, they just got to the end of the Philip Hinchcliffe era of the Tom Baker years. And so they did all these Leela episodes, and they're still doing her time period. But now they just did The Invisible Enemy, which is like the story that introduces K9 and is really trying to be spectacular, but like not. It has no budget, so I guess it looks particularly bad. And the director apparently didn't really care about it, so he wouldn't let them do reshoots and stuff like that. And it's just funny because that. And then next week is Image of the Fat Doll, which is one of my favorite stories. So it's one of the best. Probably the only Doctor Who does Lovecraft-style horror stories.
Yeah.
But so we get the same in the books, I guess, with a lot of tonal shift, and that can work sometimes. Definitely, Virgin had its ups and downs, and I guess the BBC did as well. The BBC books try to get you involved in really long story arcs, and I think that's one reason I kind of avoided the Eighth Doctor novels for the most part, just because I don't want to sift through a whole bunch of bad books to get to the ones that are really awesome.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's again, a problem that you have to deal with these kind of books, right? It's like, there might be good stuff, but you might have to hunt for it really hard. And if you're a dedicated fan, maybe that's okay. But I don't know. There's a lot of stuff I want to read, so
yeah,
I'm not that fast of a reader. But I did read 3 books in December, and this was one of them again, so I'd read this book before. I chose this book after much agonizing deliberation. I really wasn't sure. I picked it ultimately because, one, it's a 4th Doctor and Leela book, and that's a great team. And the other thing was, I mean, doing a 7th or 8th Doctor book, you always run into the risk of, there's too many connections with other stuff, like other books that we haven't read. So I think that it's not really fair to do that kind of thing on the podcast. And I don't know how we're going to tackle series fiction, because even now, in like when it's not connected to shows, the vast majority of published sci-fi in book form is in series, I think, now.
Yeah, right.
And I do think I understand the reasons for that, and I understand the appeal, but I also find that unfortunate. Like, not everything has to be a 12-book series, right? Like, I don't know. It's just, but it's just, publishers know they have a good thing. Authors know when they have a good thing, so of course they're going to go for it, and that's what people like. They want worlds that they can really immerse themselves in. So, and I think television shows actually have a lot to do with establishing that mindset, because that's what a TV show is.
Sure.
It's basically a world that you put yourself in for, I don't know, it used to be like you couldn't do more than 45 minutes a week, but now, thanks to the age of streaming and everything, you can binge your favorite show hour after hour if you want, all day long, if you have the time for it. So it's the nature of the beast, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think this was a good book to choose. I listened. Nothing. The room Stockwood gave me was bigger than my family's entire hut. 3 people slept there for many seasons. Here there was only me, yet something woke me. I got up from the floor. I took out my knife. What woke me? What woke me up? I sniffed the air. Fabric, old, mildewed. Wood, dry, dusty. Nobody has slept in this room for many seasons. Nobody but me. I sniffed again, tasting the night beyond the walls. Something woke me up. I peered into the darkness. The eyes were the weakest of the hunter's senses, but still a powerful weapon. I saw nothing beyond the walls and the floor and the glass windows. The curtains were open. So were the windows. The night looked in. I returned its cold stare. The night was an animal. It hunted her. There were things in the night, things from the beyond. Things that killed, but not for food. I did not understand them. The doctor once told me that things from the beyond were mental projections, that they were not really there. I thought I understood them, but really I did not. How can something that is not there be there? How can something else that is not there wake me up? The windows opened onto a balcony which overlooked the grounds. I looked down past the trees and the undergrowth. It was black down there. Black, green, the colors of night in this land. I looked up. Dark sky, darker clouds. The wind was familiar, but the city smells it brought were confusing. Smoke, wood, brick, glass, many different types of cloth, animals, and people. So many different people. And metal everywhere, as if I were in a temple as big as the entire place of land. Metal knives, locks, bicycles, buckles, buttons, people wearing it, horses walking on it. It was too much, like looking at the sun. The smells were too bright. I closed my eyes, lapping up the dark, the familiar, blurry patterns behind my eyelids. When I opened my eyes, the clouds had parted. There was a moon in the sky, a small, cold, lonely-looking moon. I whispered a prayer to make it happy, so that it would shine hard and make the night go away sooner and stay away longer. I did not like the night in this land. The prayer worked. I saw more light in the garden. The light was small, blinking quickly and moving fast, like many eyes in a cave of ice. I knew this light. Cryuni, death spirit. The spell of winter. It was coming here, coming for Stockwood. He was old and would die soon. I know this now. The Cryoni knows it too. Death spirit was coming for him. But I liked Stockwood. The doctor told me I was his best friend. I would protect him from the sleep of Cryuni, the sleep of death. I whispered the spell of summer to keep me safe. Held my knife in a killing grip and opened the door of my room. Outside, the house was dark and smelled like winter. I could see nothing. No glimmer of light marked the spirit's presence. I listened. Something. I could hear something. Downstairs. I moved down the stairs carefully. They were well built and did not creak. The material, carpet covering the wood, helped to muffle my footsteps. I'm used to hunting prey in a place of land. To be silent in this place was easy. Once downstairs, I checked the study, the room directly below my own. That was where the light came from. That was where the Cryuni would enter the house. I pushed the door. It would not open. I pushed harder. Still no movement. Then my hand touched something cold, metal. A lump this big would be worth a season's food for 3 people in the land. This land was strange. So much precious stuff, and yet no bars on the doors or guards on the rooms. I turned the handle. The door opened easily. Inside the study, I tasted the night. The big windows were open. I inhaled sharply, tasting grass, trees, the furry pelts of small night animals. I crouched to examine the floor. There was dirt on the carpet in the shape of a man's foot. I rose, confused. Spirits do not leave footprints. I checked the room against my memory of it from the afternoon. There was little difference. Anything of importance had already been packed. Had someone been here? Someone from outside? This afternoon, Stockwood had been frightened that someone might have stolen his Runga Runga. What if the Runga Runga was a charm to ward off evil spirits? What if Cryuni had sent a human accomplice to steal it and remove Stockwood's magical protection? And then I knew. Royston. Royston was in league with Cryuni. The death spirit would get Stockwood's soul, and Royston would take his possessions as a reward for helping the spirit. I trembled. Without Stockwood, I would not be able to find the doctor or the TARDIS. This land was strange. I did not know what was safe to eat or hunt. I did not understand why uniformed warriors with metal bicycles were not to be worshipped, while empty tombs were. I did not understand anything. I was a stranger here. I needed the doctor to explain. Somehow I understood when the doctor explained things. I got angry. Royston had set Cryuni on Stockwood. That perhaps he had plans to kill Stockwood's friends and family. The doctor was Stockwood's friend. I was his best friend. The doctor told me so. If Cryuni was here for Stockwood's soul, perhaps he was here for mine and the doctor's also. I would not allow that while I lived. Essentially, we're now in the BBC book years, and it's 1998. The BBC have been publishing original Eighth Doctor novels for, I think, a couple of years at this point, and they also have their past Doctor stuff with the previous Doctor and companion teams. They generally did like to work with characters that had already existed, but they were not averse to creating some of their own characters. Not as much, I don't think they did that as much as Virgin did. I think maybe the BBC had more of a, we're leaving the door open still for potential TV series or something like that kind of attitude where they didn't seem as keen to do that. Virgin was always introducing new companions and sometimes killing them off soon after they were introduced. But with this, we actually have a rare thing, and that is a Fourth Doctor and Leela book. I don't think we see too many of those. I know Chris Boucher, the creator of Leela, actually wrote a couple himself that are supposed to take place around this time, and I'm sure they're pretty decent. I mean, I haven't read them, but as the person who created the character and also wrote some of my favorite Tom Baker serials, as well as pretty much half of Blake Seven, the guy knows what he's doing, usually.
Yeah, definitely.
So. Yes.
The Leela episodes are definitely some of the show's best run.
Yeah. There's some really good episodes in that era.
Yeah, and it's kind of a shame that it goes downhill really fast, like towards the end, I think, of her time.
Yeah.
She doesn't get the best exit, and I kind of think that, like, generally speaking, people remember the exit of Sarah Jane Smith very fondly, and she was the previous companion. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like Leela and the Doctor didn't really get a moment like that, so that kind of took away from the impact, I think, and maybe makes it so that although she seems to be getting some attention nowadays, it seems like for a lot of the time, since the new series began, the focus was on other companions like Sarah and Melanie Bush, even from the late 80s, which is kind of weird because she doesn't really seem like her time is that fondly remembered. But the actress certainly did her best. But anyway, Leela was played on television by Louise Jameson, and she was in maybe 8 stories all told. I'm just trying to count them spontaneously, so I might be 1 or 2 off, but it sounds about right.
It's 9 by my count on Wikipedia.
9 by your count. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So the thing starts out really good, and then, I don't know, I think her last couple of stories are not favorites among me or a lot of other fans. I know some people like The Invasion of Time because it's a Gallifrey story with the Time Lords and all that stuff, and I've never been too much of a fan of it, and Leela's departure is one reason for that. But I think that exploring her time on the show more in the books is a really sensible way to go about things. And our author today, Jim Mortimore, has done just that. Jim was born in 1962, and he started writing for himself and his friends in the 1970s. And he recalls seeing Pertwee Years on television, and it was in black and white since he, like many at the time, didn't have a color set. But he said the Doctor who held the most special associations from him and his childhood was, in fact, Peter Cushing. And he said, really, though, it's the concept I like. That's what I find so clever, so innovative, so intelligent. The flexibility and mutability of the character. The wit, the danger, the fun. When you get right down to it, guess you gotta love 'em all. He's talking about, because everybody always wants to know who your favorite Doctor is. It's like cliche question among fans, and I don't know how to answer that myself, really. I mean, I like most of them for one reason or another, even the ones that don't have great stories. Usually the actor does something engaging and memorable. We were talking about Colin Baker earlier, and I think he's pretty good even.
Yeah, I think all the Doctors are good as the Doctor. It's just sometimes the quality of the stories that they happen to appear in varies.
Yeah. It's always going to be like that when you have a character that's written by many different writers, and, they all have different viewpoints and ideas about how things should be. And actually, speaking of Chris Boucher, the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension team just did an episode on Image of the Fendal, which is a story that I really like. And in that story, the Doctor hands one of the characters, who's kind of a villainous character, a gun so he can shoot himself. And it's like kind of this thing where I guess a lot of fans nowadays especially would question whether that's something the Doctor would actually do. And my feeling on that kind of thing is, well, maybe not. And you're perfectly free to, I guess, hold that against the story. But I mean, we just talked a lot about the Star Trek tie-ins and stuff, and how I think too much oversight over what you're doing as a writer can be really frustrating and a negative experience. So I don't know. I mean, if somebody wants to write the character like that and say that his villain is so terrible that this is something he would actually do, then I don't know. I might be convinced. And so all this to say, a bit of a tangent, but essentially we're going to come up against, again, attempts at editorial oversight here. So apparently the Doctor Who Appreciation Society had an old fanzine called Cosmic Mask, and that's where Mortimore made his first fanfiction writing attempts. The editor of that magazine was John Peel. No, not that John Peel, but the writer of Doctor Who and Star Trek books, which is a nice connection between our two properties today. He's written a lot of other stuff too. He wrote at least one Avengers book, Too Many Targets, which I also have, and published, I think, one or two Next Generation books and one Deep Space Nine books, which are actually quite popular. So I haven't read them, but yeah, it's interesting to see there is some crossover in our writing communities. Not a lot, but some.
Yeah.
So Jim got involved with this group of fans calling themselves Audiovisuals in the mid-1980s, and that's where I first heard of him. Well, I know that you guys are, but if the audience, anybody is familiar with Big Finish, Audiovisuals kind of was the precursor, or one of the precursors to that. And quite a few of the people who later became involved with the Big Finish audio drama production company they kind of got their start with Audiovisuals. And the quality was really not bad for 1980s fan productions. They sounded pretty much, maybe not right at the start, but pretty much by the time they got to their second series audio plays, it was pretty much pro 80s radio drama quality. Like, they compared the production values to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that the BBC put out, for example. And Jim only tends to mention his music because he is a composer as well. So he did a lot of music for that series, but he also did some writing for the Audiovisuals. And as far as I can tell, some of it was uncredited, but generally they goofed around a lot by using weird pseudonyms and stuff, so you can't really tell who's responsible for what, some of these things. He's generally quite critical of his own writing efforts, saying especially that he doesn't really know how to build plot foundations. And in the past he said, so he's written several new adventures for Virgin. I think there were about 4 of them, and a couple of BBC books. I've read most of the Virgin ones, I think, and I enjoyed them. One was called Blood Heat, and it's basically this alternate timeline story where the events of the story, the Silurians, turned out different, and the Silurians were in fact able to awaken and essentially reclaim the Earth. So it's an alternate past where all the Doctor's friends are now pretty much in hiding, and Unit's obviously long gone, and there's dinosaurs everywhere, and it's pretty cool. One thing that I definitely think that Jim likes spectacle, and he's actually really good at writing that kind of stuff. He did say Eye of Heaven was great because Leela was such fun to write for. He's written, like I said, several Who novels, and then that all ended with his book Campaign, which he has a lot to say about because he essentially was given a brief to write a story about the Doctor encountering Alexander the Great, and I guess he pretty much added in too many complications, and the back and forth was very frustrating for, I guess, both him and the editor, and ultimately they decided to cancel the book because he wasn't giving them what they wanted, and that wasn't what he wanted to do, and he wanted to take things in a different direction, and they said no. So he ended up self-publishing the book, or he published it for, I think the proceeds went to Down syndrome charity, and he published this book, and it's, yeah, I haven't really got around to reading it yet, but I'd definitely be curious to. It's kind of supposed to be something that engenders admiration, but also frustration, because, it's the most, I guess, him going all the way with being as totally experimental and unrestricted as he wants. And, there could have been reasons why the editor might have been like, yeah, that's not the kind of book we want, but I don't know. I'm still curious to see what it's like.
I haven't read it myself, but the first time I ever heard of Campaign was someone essentially calling it the House of Leaves of Doctor Who books. The formatting is just very complex and strange.
I saw that comment too. I don't think it's quite that, I don't even know what to call House of Leaves. It's metatextual, definitely, but also the order is weird. You can read it in different orders and stuff. I don't know, but yeah, I've also seen that comparison, so it certainly looks interesting. He also has a Babylon 5 book out and some of his own stuff, a lot of which he sells on one of his websites, which we'll link here. But he has the director's cut of Blood Heat, so he's actually also taken some of his Doctor Who books and changed things around a bit and expanded them and made them, I guess, his own thing. And
right.
In order to do that, he said he did have to alter a few things in the text to avoid copyright problems. So I don't really know what that means.
It's a common issue for some of these, for sure.
Yeah. He also wrote a number of books for Crocker, which is a series of books based on a British crime drama show that I've never seen anything of, but apparently it stars Robbie Coltrane and Christopher Eccleston, and it's the series that came out in the 1990s. But he lives in Bristol, I believe. Yeah, penned a couple of Big Finish audios as well, The Natural History of Fear, and one of the Tomorrow People ones. Yeah, it's very unfortunate about the Tomorrow People, because, so I've never listened to it, but I've listened to another series that this happened to that Big Finish did, Sapphire and Steel, and unfortunately you can't get those anymore because they lost the license, and again, it's one of the frustrating things about this kind of format is that the stuff can get taken away from you very unexpectedly and quickly. And although, yeah, sure, the audience we could find them on eBay or something like that, or not that we would do this, but download them from the internet, right?
Never.
But the thing is, yeah, I mean, they can't sell them anymore. So this stuff that they worked on and produced, and it's just pretty much wiped off the books forever. Not very cool, in my opinion, that people can do that to your work. But again, that's one of the things you have to accept when you work in tie-in land, I guess. So he does have at least one original fantasy novel, Scaldin Land, which was released in 2011. In general, in his writing, he cites Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein and Ray Bradbury as influences that he read early on. And the first, quote, adult book he remembers reading was Clarke's A Fall of Moondust, which is certainly something that I considered adding to Chrononauts one day. I would like to do a Clarke book at some point, but I don't really know. I'm thinking The City of the Stars might be a good one, but...
You haven't read that one myself. All the ones I have read, I've really enjoyed, so I would certainly like to visit Clarke at some point.
Yeah. I definitely think that would be worth going into. I read this book a long time ago, and I remembered liking it, and I think we kind of went into this a little while ago, but I was saying that I really wanted to pick something that was standalone, and also, dealt with characters that we all were familiar with. So I think that was my main reason, as well as knowing that Yeah, it's a pretty good book. I read a really good Eighth Doctor book recently, and I was thinking, oh, it would be cool to do an Eighth Doctor book, but so many of them are tied into stuff that's connected to other books. I kind of just feel like it'd be too much to go into.
Yeah. I've read a couple of Eighth Doctor books, but the first one I ended up reading was Earthworld, which had been reprinted for the 50th anniversary. And a very strange book to choose because it is very reliant on things that when I was reading it, I really was not sure what it was referencing. So
Yeah.
Don't know why. I'm sure there were other options, but that one I definitely needed some context.
Yeah, it's a very strange choice to release that independently for the 50th anniversary and do a reprint of it because it does seem like it's really tied in with a whole bunch of stuff. And it doesn't really seem even like one of the more celebrated books from that time period. So, I don't know. It's a strange choice, but so be it, I guess. But what do you guys think of this book?
I enjoyed it quite a bit. I really like the weird sea aspect. We did a bunch of these stories and novels a couple years now, I guess. And those were a lot of fun, and I like the format a lot. So it was kind of cool to revisit that, especially in the horror elements a lot more played up than some of the stories that we covered where it had it more in the background, or at least sometimes it did. But yeah, this one gets pretty gory at times, which I didn't expect, and has some pretty shocking scenes, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. And I guess the other thing I liked is he really does capture the voice of Leela very, very well. I mean, just Leela's background makes for really good material for these like awkward comic scenes that he's pretty good at doing, and there's a lot of these in the novel. So that was fun to read. Unlike the Star Trek novel that we talked about in the last episode, this one has like a ton of plot and things going at all times. So there's like all these like little twists and turns everywhere, and it's kind of fun to like follow where the trails all lead.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there were some reviews I read of this online that didn't like it, and they were saying that it didn't feel like a Doctor Who story because I guess it was more like on a ship for a lot. But I don't know. I don't really agree with that at all. To me, it felt very Doctor Who in that there's something that Doctor Who does a fair amount where it finds this like weird or unexplained thing from antiquity or Neolithic times and give it some alien aspect to it. We talked about the Antikythera mechanism in our Array 1 episode, this ancient astronomical calculator that got sunk in the Mediterranean for 2,000 years, that only pieces of it survive. I mean, you could easily envision a Doctor Who episode where he goes to ancient Greece and this piece of this computer is actually part of a big thing that the Cybermen were tinkering with or whatever,
Yeah.
And we get a story like that here. And it's always fun to see that.
I mean, regarding whether or not this is quote unquote Doctor Who enough for something, like we had already been talking a little bit about how like Doctor Who as something that again was written by multiple people over several decades at this point, it can kind of be whatever it wants to be. And it doesn't really, this feels more in line with like some of the more historical episodes of the show. This is that similar vibe. But I also really agree with you, Nate, on like Leela's voice and the way that he really captures both her voice and the voice of other characters in the novel. I think even the Doctor has like a pretty good voice in this novel. And I'm glad that we paired this with Wounded Sky, since they both feel very bound to like characterization and do really good jobs with characterization.
Yeah, and it's cool that like Leela is the main focus really of the novel and not necessarily the Doctor. Like she does a lot of the stuff and the Doctor's kind of in the background for a lot of it. Like, I mean, he's pulling some of more of the strings and he knows obviously a lot more than pretty much every other character does, as the case always. But we get to see the story through the eyes of a lot of these other characters. And the characters he introduces specifically for the story are pretty fun to deal with too. I mean, they're just straight out of a lot of those Victorian sea novels that we read several episodes back.
Yeah, very much so. And as to Gretchen, you mentioned the historical epic kind of stories, and he did say that he was owing a considerable debt to Marco Polo, the story. I definitely get a similar feeling from this.
Yeah.
The science fiction content definitely increases in the second half, which I actually think is, I mean, it works pretty well, but I definitely did sort of prefer the first half of this book, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I like the C section a little bit better, but I wouldn't have minded if it was only that aspect of it without the second half.
No, definitely not. I mean, I didn't mind the second half, but I think my complaint about it is that the science fiction elements, when they do come in, it does feel like a little bit rushed. It's just kind of like a lot happens at once and almost like...
And again, it kind of makes me think if this was Jim's director's cut, it would probably be a lot longer. And, the fans of the book might like that more, and people that didn't like the book probably would like it less. You know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of...
Yeah.
I mean, we definitely have to talk about the structure and the way the book is structured. Well, first off, I mentioned that the whole book is in first person, and that's pretty rare for a Doctor Who book. You do see it every now and then. In fact, the first ever Doctor Who novelization, Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks, as it was originally called. I think they changed that name pretty quickly. But that was told in first person from Ian's point of view. And a few of the other Hartnell First Doctor books have a first person narrator, especially Donald Cotton that liked doing the historical stuff. He wrote The Mythmakers and The Gunfighters, and although he didn't write it, he did the novelization of The Romans. He also liked to write in first person, but it generally something that both the novelization and original fiction Doctor Who writers tend to stay away from more often than not. And I think that definitely this book being told that way works very much in its favor, but it's also sort of told out of order, kind of. I mean, the even number chapters happen before the odd number chapters, pretty much. It's the way that it works. So in the first part, there's like two time periods that kind of you're following two different parts of the story at once. And for the most part, I think this works really well, but I think that it stops working well about 3/4 of the way through the book, because I guess just the way certain events are told, we already know about certain things that happen before we read about them happening, and there's also one or two things that I think are missing that would have been nice to have included, which I'll point out when we do the summary. But basically, all the characters are really good, except one, and I think you guys probably know which character that I mean. It's the sister of Alexander, Jennifer Richards.
Yeah, right.
And she's just not like... I don't know. I feel like all it was needed was maybe something a little bit earlier on that told us more about her and stuff. Like, I just think the way that she gets revealed, and then I think 90% of the time, I think the structure of the book works really well, but I think that towards the end, it might have been actually better to adopt a more linear approach, because it just starts to get a little bit confusing and a little bit like, oh, so did that happen before then? It's like, oh, they're here again. Were they here before, or are they going to be there after? Like, it's still kind of like an even odd chapter split pretty much, but it starts to feel more fragmented somehow. And so I think maybe once they got to the island, he could have probably just straightened it up and just told it as a linear story, because I think that might have served a little better in this particular, like at this moment. But I actually really like the juxtaposition of the sea chapters with the planning the sea voyage chapters. I thought that was really, really nice. I liked reading those two stories simultaneously. That was a lot of fun. But what do you guys think about the structure of it?
Yeah, I think overall it worked. Yeah, I would say the plotting and pacing of the final quarter or so, it's maybe doesn't come together as well as it could have. But I think overall it works. It does have that like cliffhanger, the end of every chapter thing that the Doctor Who TV show does too. Yeah, which I think is a fun element to have.
That's definitely a fun aspect of original Doctor Who that, I don't know, some people don't like it, some people love it. I grew up with them, and I always enjoyed the cliffhangers, even though, yeah, maybe some of them get resolved, like kind
instantly.
of,
yeah.
Really, like, oh, that I was waiting all week for that.
Yeah.
My favorite is, I can't remember which serial it was, where it seems like someone shoots the doctor or the companion, and then the very second, like, shot of the next episode is, oh, he just shot another guy. Like, they're completely fine. It's all right.
Yeah. Or they reshot the beginning so that it looks like what happened in the first episode. You realize that's not at all what happened.
Yeah.
I think there's one or two instances where they did that. But in general, though, I really like the cliffhangers, especially not so much for how they get resolved, but how they end the episodes, right? That is like leave you really wanting to tune in next week because, yeah, a lot of the time you had to wait a week to watch the next episode. And I think people who watch the original series nowadays, sometimes they don't really take that in consideration. You know, they watch a 7-part serial all in one go, and they're like, well, I'm really tired, and there was sure a lot of escape and capture, and it's the original serial took almost 2 months to broadcast. So, like, if you were watching that over a 2-month period, you would probably feel about it differently.
Yeah.
And you might actually have to miss an episode and still kind of know what was going on. So, I mean, you could say that some of these things are weaknesses of storytelling, but they worked for what the show was at that time.
Yeah, I think they worked great. I mean, I think the format of the show was definitely one of its strengths in that it varies from a lot of the other science fiction shows that I've seen from that time period, or really at all, where the format is a story that's contained in roughly an hour and a half to 2.5 hours or so of programming versus either like completely episodic or like an arc-based like season type version of storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah, just like I do have to sometimes remind myself that stories like that big space opera we were talking about earlier, the Daleks Master Plan.
Yeah.
That was on TV for 3 months originally.
Right.
Like for 3 months Doctor Who turned into that. And that was what you got.
They even do the Christmas break in the middle of it for whatever reason.
Yeah, a tradition that the new series picked up on. That was the only Christmas special of the original show, and now, actually, I think they stopped doing them in the new series too. Now they do New Year's specials or something.
Yeah,
but they were doing Christmas specials all through the Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat eras.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely like that aspect too. I think the book handled it well. I think for the most part, I'm happy with the fact that we got many different first-person points of view, and I think you did a pretty good job of differentiating them, but I do feel like I would have exchanged out one or two for other ones, and we'll get to that when we get into more detail about the plot. But I definitely think that for the most part, he chose well. I would have liked to see a chapter or two from the point of view of the ship's captain. That would have been cool.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe an earlier Jennifer chapter or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like she could have definitely been worked in the story a little bit better.
Yeah, because, I mean, I understand where Mortimer was going with her and what he was trying to do with her, but I feel like if it had been executed just a little differently, it would have worked a lot better.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess without ado then, let's talk about the plot so we can get into that with more detail.
Sure.
We do start out with a prologue that takes place 30 years before the story, and has to do, well, the rest of the story, I should say, and has to do with an Englishman named Stockwood, who's on the run, and he is at the navel of the world in Easter Island, which is where a lot of this book is set. Interesting, very remote location to set a book, and he does actually talk in the notes at the end about some of the books that he used for research, which is cool. But yeah, Easter Island, it's now a territory of Chile, and it's a remote location in the Pacific among the Polynesian islands. And today, about 7,000 people live there. So there's actually more people living there now than there was during the time when this story takes place. And for a long time afterwards, there was speculation about what happened on Easter Island, because it seemed like the whole place got deforested and there's there's not really a lot of vegetation. And, of course, they have their huge stone monoliths, which it's, again, one of those subjects where I guess people see giant artifacts made by a older pre-European culture and wonder where the hell they came from. And it's kind of funny, all the theories that people come up with. And I guess to an extent this book plays into it because it was aliens. Right. But I don't know. It's that fun ancient alien stuff. Doctor Who loved playing with that too. So getting back to our talk about what is Doctor Who? Well, Doctor Who can be anything, including ancient aliens. So, sea stories too. Why not? And yeah, I mean, all those, it doesn't feel like Doctor Who kind of comments. Much like Star Trek, Doctor Who has different camps to it, and the fandom that is. And there are the people that seem to want everything to be very traditional all the time. And then there's the people that think that the novels, especially, and things like that, are a chance for different things to be done with the concept than what you would normally see. Because yes, Doctor Who can be almost anything, but most of the time it's a pretty specific thing. Especially around this time, the late 90s and early 2000s. From what I remember seeing, there was a lot of talk about this in fandom and about, what can Doctor Who be? What is it? How can we tell stories that not only would you not see on the television because, it wouldn't fit the budget, but would you not see because it doesn't fit people's normal ideas of what Doctor Who usually is? But, I don't know. There's no reason you can't play with the format a lot. And for that, one of the reasons why I think, Jim's talking about its flexibility, and it really is, in potential anyway. But this Mr. Stockwood thinks he can hear the sound of stone grinding behind him, and thinks of walking giants as he swims for his life. And you see, he's stolen something from the islanders, and it's one of 100 stone tablets, and him and his friends seem to have robbed these people. So his friend, though, has been captured and is taking part in a ritual on the island. And this Stockwood watches as somebody basically loses his mind. And this is the person who was guiding them on the island. And I guess there's a feeling that he's been a traitor. And he's being pursued, but he does manage to get away and onto the ship that they came on as the islanders attack, and they're very upset about their artifact being stolen. So, leaving his friend behind, Stockwood just kind of leaves, and that sets into motion everything that happens going forward. Stockwood hasn't stopped thinking about this in 30 years, so he's decided that he wants to mount another expedition, but he doesn't have any money for it. And that's how the Doctor and Leela come into things. And the Doctor sees an article in the newspaper about it. And so he goes to this Stockwood's house in London. And Stockwood and the Doctor seem to hit it off pretty well right away. And Stockwood starts telling his story. And Leela sees from his body language that if he's not lying, then part of him doesn't believe part of the story that he's telling. And she and the Doctor, in their own ways, believe he's haunted by memories. And Stockwood is an archaeologist, and he needs a sponsor. And he wants to know more about the Moe Moe, the walking stones. And he's been laughed out of scientific society and basically broke. So the Doctor conjures up a precious diamond and said, I'll buy your ship, and we'll make this happen. Because he's a Doctor, and he has time on his hands because he's a Time Lord, and he can do this sort of thing. And Stockwood admits there's been some break-ins lately at his house, and they found the translation of the inscriptions that he'd made from the tablets, and some notes on language structure. So he's been discredited, and he can't think of who would want to steal from him. but he suspects someone has the idea of getting to Rapa Nui, which is the native name for Easter Island, first. So Leela and Stockwood hang out at the house while the Doctor decides to go hunting for a ship that they can... And he has some way of getting funds, too, by selling precious jewels that he's just keeping around. So Leela is puzzled by everything as they go for a walk, especially the horses. And again, we have that infinitely repeated fan question of, when does this book take place? Because, yeah, I mean, I think that it's supposed to take place after Talons of Weng-Chiang because it mentions her having been there before, but then she would have also been in Victorian London then, so she should have seen some of these things and been somewhat familiar at least, but I don't know. Doesn't matter. Not really worth worrying about too much. I don't think Jim really refers to any other story besides Leela's debut. So if you really wanted to, you could say that, I don't know, maybe it takes place not long after that one and before any other TV story. And you could say maybe they went to Earth some other time before Talons and it was just a brief stopover and she didn't have time to observe anything around her. So there's always ways to figure it out and work it out in your own head. I mean, I think nowadays, I don't know. I mean, I know some fans still worry about this, but I think now with like Big Finish slotting in literally hundreds of adventures in the midst of the TV show timeline and even introducing new companions to hang out with old ones that we never saw on television, I don't really think that it's something people should spend too much time thinking about. But they visit the tomb of Stockwood's friend Alexander. Alex was his only boyhood friend during a really harsh time, and there's no body in the tomb because they left him there on Rapa Nui. And Leela recounts how she committed heresy as a young woman of the 17, and how her father took the test of the Horda in her place, failed, and was killed. And there's really only connection with that one story, and Jim actually really mines it for everything that he can, which is really cool because it's the kind of continuity I think that works. Like, it doesn't feel gratuitous because most of it is told from Leela's first-person point of view, and obviously she's very influenced by her past experience, and this is still quite early in her travels with the Doctor, I guess, so she can't help but think of certain things, like she's overwhelmed by the fact that there's so much metal around, because to her, metal is a holy thing, and there's not that much of it, and so these people are, like, squandering all this metal and showing it off everywhere, and it's like, it feels wrong to her. And so she's having to deal with all these kind of things. And
it makes sense from a practical standpoint from writing a tie-in novel that a companion's debut serial is probably one that most people will have seen who might not have necessarily seen, like, all of the serials that companion was in. So putting excessive references to, like, everything they've done might bog down the reader or introduce too many confusing elements that might be hard to follow.
Yeah, definitely. And both in the notes and in another interview and in the questions that Jim kindly answered for me, he said that he really appreciated the work of Chris Boucher in creating Leela, and that you can't help but love her personality and her linguistic corruption and, like, all these different traits that she has.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of fun moments in here, and her character is a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure. So after a while, they return to Stockwood's place, only to find another break-ins happen, and the Doctor's already sitting in the drawing room with champagne. Turns out the butler apparently is responsible for the theft, and the Doctor caught him trying to steal the Rongo Rongo. And Stockwood is very relieved. So the Doctor's got a huge bag of gold with him, and now they can get started, and they can leave in the morning. And the Doctor leaves, and at this point, I don't know, maybe it's just because I just was watching the Lord of the Rings films, but the Doctor really reminds me of Gandalf during this part of the book for some reason.
Always running around in the background doing things, going place from here to there and all that. Yeah, totally.
Like the planner of everything.
Yeah, and it's like, and he's doing that thing where he's like, okay, meet me at this place in this many days, right? And then the people show up and something went wrong and he's not there. Like, that's what happens in Lord of the Rings, right? So But yeah, so we also meet James Royston, who's Stockwood's physician and friend. And he wants to come along. He's kind of been worried about Stockwood and his state of mind. Stockwood's happy about this, but not Leela, who doesn't trust him. Royston claims to have already met the doctor, who encouraged him to come. And Leela is definitely suspicious, and it's kind of cool because this is never borne out. Like, he does a really good job of showing how canny Leela is, but she's not always correct because she doesn't have the civilization kind of reference points, and sometimes the way Victorian English gentleman acts might make her distrustful. So, and this is where we get the unusual doctor point of view section, and this is a fun thing that no writers of the books is really supposed to do. I don't know, maybe the BBC were more lax about it, but I believe even during the Virgin New Adventures time, their New Adventures Bible, so to speak, had a thing in it which stated that you're not supposed to get too into the Doctor's head. And the reason is that, they want to keep the character mysterious, and especially the New Adventures were infamous for having the Doctor, being pretty much sort of on the sidelines, directing things from the background, and being very mysterious about his plans, and not really often telling the other people around him what he was doing or planning, so they had to guess, and it was a source of great angst, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it was a little bit too much. It's kind of one of those things where it's that weird balance that you get in fiction sometimes, where you just want to go, look, if you just talk to each other about the problems you're having, everything would be fine, but nobody does that because you want to extend the story out, right? But here, Jim does it for a couple of chapters, and it's pretty nice. I mean, not every thought the Doctor has to be connected with revealing some great secret or something like that. Like, it's I don't know. I'm kind of glad that not all Doctor Who books would do this, but this once, it's fine. I have no issue with it. It's pretty fun. So we hear about his arrival at Portsmouth, which is where they're going to buy or charter the ship, and he does some sightseeing and visits the harbor master and announces he wants to buy a ship. And he has a lot of gold, and the harbor master is pretty overwhelmed. And the Doctor pokes and prods at the Tweed, which is the name of the ship, and the men are very curious. And he teaches them to sing Beatles songs, and they're all drunk. And I'm not sure, somehow I didn't quite picture the Fourth Doctor being a fan of the Beatles, but it works. I enjoyed that. It was pretty fun.
I feel like Ian introduced the Doctor to the Beatles after that one episode, The Chase, when he's listening to them, and since then he's been a fan.
Yeah.
That could be, yeah. Vicky wanted to hear the Beatles, and she was surprised that it was classical music. Somebody online was telling me yesterday that he's never heard a Beatles album in full, so he's planning to rectify that in March. And it's just so funny that it's become such a part of popular culture, and even the young people today know who the Beatles are, and it's one of those things that has well survived the generations. Kind of interesting. So the Doctor discovers, to his chagrin, the TARDIS has been loaded aboard a ship for India. Oops. That gets resolved pretty quickly, but it's kind of fun to think, oh no, he's like, the TARDIS is being taken away. How are they going to find it? The Doctor isn't very concerned, though, and he goes to book hotel rooms for the night. And the Doctor's really nice to a guy who tries to rob him, and some neighborhood kids. And then he's accosted by this evil-looking dock worker character. And then, back at the Stockwoods, Leela wakes from a disturbing dream. And this is the part that I might read. But the city at night's very frightening, and she sees light blinking near, and she thinks it's the spirit of death coming for Stockwood. She goes downstairs, where she discovers that somebody's been down there, and she thinks it's Royston, but no, it's not. It's just that damn butler again. And now he's been shot because he was creeping around. And Stockwood doesn't want to abort the expedition and suggests burying the body in the grounds. So Royston thinks that's very immoral, but he seems almost more amused than anything else. So Stockwood, Royston, and Leela arrive at the hotel, and they find they have no rooms, and the doctor is missing. So Leela is determined to go find him, and she's pretty angry that the men don't show her respect. And many of the men in the town seem to think that she's either a wife or a prostitute or something. And she's pretty put off by this, as you might imagine. And she follows the scent of blood to near the harbor and seems to be retracing the doctor's footsteps. And she discovers the child the doctor met earlier. She tells her that the doctor went with this evil-looking guy. It seems like something they could have checked on, but I don't know. Their baggage is all hanging out by the hotel, so there's no rooms. Somebody has to keep an eye on it. So Leela seems to be hunted by possibly the same man who accosted the doctor, and they play this cat and mouse game for a while. And she's ready to do an ambush when she stumbles on a busy market and pretty much becomes overwhelmed by everything around her because it's very chaotic and loud and smelly, and she kind of starts threatening people with her knife, and unfortunately she lunges at this short red-haired guy who seems to be following her. He shouts, "Cutthroat!" and all these people start rushing her and knock her down. It's pretty cool the way he describes the environment around her, and she's like wandering around, and all this stuff to prepare for the adventure on sea is pretty cool. I quite liked all these chapters.
Yeah.
So the others discover that Leela is missing, and James kind of wants to abandon Leela and the doctor, but Stockwood is not willing to do this, and they somehow do manage to find their ship. I'm not really sure how they managed to do that, considering the doctor's missing, and yeah, I guess they were able to track down somehow that this is where the doctor had been. James Royston no longer seems like the voice of reason in Stockwood's life, and Stockwood is firm and suggests they start looking for the others at this 3 Tons Tavern. Stockwood barges into the middle of a massive bar fight, but then just stands there waiting for James to do something. Luckily, James has a gun, and they find a woman with a knife crouching defiantly in a corner, but it's not Leela. And she was there at some point, though. And they're about to leave in disgrace when Stockwood is coshed on the head by a short red-haired man who seems to be everywhere all at once. Leela and the 3 of them, they're all tied up and dumped in a harbor sewer somewhere. And I think it's in this chapter that the doctor does his thing where he name drops a lot of people he's met in his travels, including Harry Houdini. But Harry's tricks don't help him escape. Leela, though, manages to break a post she's tied to, and the doctor wants to go back to the 3 Tons to find out who's responsible for this, but he says they'll still be back at the ship on time, but gets Royston and Stockwood to swim for it. The doctor and Leela climb up into a tunnel under the tavern, and there's an open door leading to a cellar full of beer kegs. And Nate, this is where you get your mention of Old Peculiar Brew.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, you enjoyed the reference.
Yeah, that stuff is great.
The red-haired enemy is in the cellar, and he taunts them. And his name's Stump, which we find out later. And he feels very confident, and he says he'll be well paid to get rid of them. And he's not telling anything. He'll just take the gold from the doctor when he's dead. And he's a good hunter, and even manages to outwit Leela in the darkness for a while. But she eventually brains him with an ale cask. And Leela thinks they should kill him, but of course the doctor says no. And the book does a really good job of highlighting how the doctor and Leela are friends, but Leela thinks very differently and delivers her kind of position in a very cold, implacable, but very logical way. And I don't know, I appreciated that. They only have moments to spare before the ship sails. As they run, Leela is shot in the arm by the revived red-headed man, and the doctor carries her as he runs. And they manage to reach the ship, and the doctor jumps as it's moving from the jetty. And they cling to the side, and the red-headed man is stopped by police. And he dives into the water amid a hail of bullets. But they're not onto it after all, because on deck, Stockwood and Royston are being held at gunpoint by a cloaked figure, and there are seamen gathered in a hostile fashion. So then we get a bit of a time jump. This is, I think, where I would have liked a little bit more of that to be filled in, and maybe not so much of one or two things in the second part. Like, I don't know. I wanted to see more of the Jennifer Richards character from this point. And I think, because I think she's the one responsible for their predicament, essentially.
Right,
Yeah.
Her point of view is, I mean, it makes sense, but it's just not, We skip over her taking them prisoner and locking everybody in the hold, and we actually go to the beginning now, because I've been sort of avoiding the structure of the book and just telling it in a linear fashion. So at this point, we're kind of back in the opening chapter with Leela traveling on ship. And we get some really cool stuff with her learning how to be a sailor, basically. It's pretty clear that quite a lot has happened. The voyage has already lasted many weeks, and the ship is low on stores. Leela's quite at home on deck, and she knows all the men by name, and she knows the names of the various parts of the ship as well, so she's obviously been asking a lot of questions and listening as people talk and do their work. And she seems particularly friendly with Jack, who I think is the cook's assistant, and he's also, I can't remember what his other responsibility is, but he seems to hang out in the crow's nest a lot, watching stuff. So, yeah. Stockwood and Leela have really, I guess, become good friends. I mean, the Doctor did one of his doctorly things, and he's like telling Leela, oh, watch him, he's your best friend. Right, and of course she sort of interprets that literally, but she doesn't really know quite how to interpret it, and then just the Doctor joking around. And I don't know, I think sometimes it seems like the writers did write the Doctor to be a little bit condescending towards her in a couple of the stories, but for the most part, it does really seem like a friendly, bantering relationship, and she gives back as much as she gets. So, I don't know, I mean, I think Jim Mortimore is really tapping into that. And I don't really think the Doctor comes across as condescending. I don't think he calls her savage more than once. So.
Yeah, and also what's interesting is the part when Leela meets Stockwood and, like, she thinks of him as a savage. Like, an animal, basically. Because of the way that he responds to her. So it's sort of, I like seeing Mortimer kind of subvert that trope of Leela being savage by thinking others are less on point as she is.
Yeah, definitely. And the book really plays with that perspective a lot, and it's pretty cool. So yeah, all kinds of cool stuff happens on the journey. There's, of course, storms. There's all kinds of cool stuff. And pretty much if you like the sea adventure genre, there's definitely stuff here to enjoy in all these parts. And I wouldn't have minded if there was more of that even, but a good chunk of the first half of the book is taken up by the sea voyage. And Leela gets to narrate many of the chapters herself and talk about how she likes to hang out with the pigs. Sometimes they're better companions than people. She doesn't trust the captain of the ship because apparently he took a bribe to imprison them in the hold and stuff. But all that seems to be mostly over and forgotten now. And Stewart seems like a pretty cool character. He likes to show Leela things and teaches her a little bit about geology and geography and stuff like that. And yeah, I kind of wanted to see a chapter from him. I think that would have been cool, especially actually towards the latter part of the book. So it's a shame that he doesn't get a moment, but can't really give it to everybody, I suppose. There is a big storm that they have to weather though, and it damages the ship pretty badly. And they haven't lost anybody, but they're way off course into dangerous, icy territory, which is good since they lost all their fresh water. And Leela still wants to investigate because she noticed that somebody is being kept in a cabin, and she doesn't know who it is, and she thinks there's a sick person in there. So she does eventually find the captain's keys, and she opens up the cabin, and, well, it's that Stump guy who's been actually rescued. And he was hanging on to the bottom of the ship, and he'd been shot, and his wounds got infected, and he's pretty much a feverish madman now. And Jennifer Richards seems to want to protect him, And she is actually, I didn't really realize this till later, but she is, of course, the sister of Stockwood's friend, Alexandra. And yes, her whole reason for doing all this is that she wants vengeance, basically. And she hates Stockwood because she thinks that, rightfully thinks that he basically abandoned his friend and left him to die on Easter Island.
And again, a chapter at the beginning where she talks about all that, how she wants to get revenge. Like, even almost immediately after the prologue, I think would have helped her character immensely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know that it had to be that early, but at least, have a chapter where, the Doctor and Leela finally make it on board the ship, and then we meet her, and then, we find out what she was doing, and maybe why. I mean, it doesn't seem like Leela really understands everything. There haven't been too many conversations between the different parties, but the Doctor clearly knows everything because he's been talking to Richards too. So, and there's a very Jules Verne-ish thing here, where also an author that Mortimer mentions at one point, but there's a fight between a sperm whale and a giant squid. It was total 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, this scene was really cool.
Oh, yeah. And it's just pretty gory. Animals are biting chunks out of each other, and there's sharks circling, and it's you wouldn't want to be in the water, that's for sure. But yeah, so Leela goes over the side of the ship, but the water's full of sharks, and unfortunately Royston can't swim, and Leela has to stab a shark to death, which is pretty awesome. And Tweed's too far away now, and they find some wreckage from the splintered deck rail, and Leela ties Royston to some lifebuoys while she does a number on the squid too. And here's where they do the awesome Leela rides the whale chapter. And apparently Jim had to fight for this chapter. This is one of the things that the editor wanted him to not include, and he essentially had to fight to keep this chapter in.
I'm glad he won the battle.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit over the top, but again, it's super fun.
It's totally over the top, but it's the thing is, I think that's one of his strengths is writing those giant spectacular stuff.
Yeah.
Like in Blood Heat, there's scenes where there's Silurians flying around on dinosaurs and humans on gliders, and there's pitch battles and stuff, and it's you can tell that he just likes this kind of stuff, and I think he's pretty good at it. I mean, this is hard for some people to pull off. I mean, I couldn't pull off action scenes like that. So everybody has, I guess, their particular thing, and I'm sure we've all read action scenes that were not very well done. And, some people's strength is dialogue and introspection, and some people's strength is action, and that's fine and good. But Royston's pretty sick, and he's suffering from exposure, and the whale is pretty agitated and keep trying to submerge, but can't stay under due to not getting enough oxygen. And there's a big black column, a tornado! And pretty much a miracle that they survive. They have to climb into the dead whale's mouth, which probably is really stinky and unpleasant.
Yeah. Whales are huge.
Oh, yeah. So we get another time jump, and they do make it to Easter Island. Well, that is the Doctor and them do. And Leela eventually does too, and they all seem to find each other. I personally, I'm not sure, after really realizing just how remote Easter Island is, I kind of feel like if Leela just ran into a bunch of Polynesian fishermen, I don't know that they would really want to take them to Easter Island. But I don't know, that's just kind of, but I'm not sure, right? I can't say for certain, but we don't really see this part of the journey. So again, it feels like I'm not sure that I necessarily need everything to be in here. I mean, I don't need the whole book to be real-time descriptions of how they got from point A to B to C, but I am a little unclear on certain things that seem to be brushed over a little bit. So, because Easter Island is literally thousands of miles from anything.
Yeah, right. The Pacific Ocean is incredibly vast compared to pretty much everything else on the planet, and it is kind of interesting how many of these places that are just totally remote, that are literally thousands of miles away from the next island, there actually are.
Yeah, exactly.
Because Easter Island isn't the only one.
Now, it's possible that I didn't really look into the details of this, and this might be in one of the books that Jim read for research, because he does talk about a couple of books on the island. But, I mean, since the island does seem to be low on natural resources, it could be that they had worked out, like, trade things with the other island group and stuff, and then that they regularly sent boats there. But it just seems like it's so far away from anything. It's not just like, oh, can you drop us off at Easter Island? That's where our friends are. And like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, the Tweed is arrived, and yeah, everybody's, Stockwood anyway, and I guess presumably the Doctor are quite haunted by the fact that Leela might be dead. Although the Doctor generally seems to think that she probably survives, and because he knows how resourceful she is. And he said, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, well, Leela is from a world where God is real and not positively predisposed toward her and her people, and yet she survived. So I'm pretty sure she can deal with whatever she has to face on the ocean. And it's remarkable confidence, but I think in the case of Leela, yeah, it seems to be earned. And if I was stranded somewhere in the middle of the ocean, I would probably feel relatively safe with her as well, as long as I didn't get on her bad side.
Although Royston was on her bad side, and she still was willing to save him.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, they've arrived at the same bay, and Stockwood's kind of having deja vu from 30 years ago. And he basically relates the past expedition to the Doctor and explains what happened. And there's a bunch of more Stockwood chapters in this part, and it's pretty good because, yeah, I mean, Stockwood seems like a pretty nice guy, and he's like, seems to be fair and good-natured, but he's definitely a product of his time. And he has a very kind of paternalistic, kind of condescending attitude toward the Polynesians, as I suppose most Victorian men of his time, even the explorers, probably had. But they're looking at the stone monuments when suddenly the Tweed gets attacked by some Peruvian slavers who've anchored on the other side of the island and come around to ambush the new arrivals. And they've been there for a bit already, and they've captured a bunch of the islanders. And the islanders, basically, they're no match for the Peruvians and their guns. And this kind of stuff really did happen at this time, for sure. And generally, the Peruvians are very piratical and cruel, and we don't really see too much of them, but we do get to hang out with their captain a bit. And, I mean, yeah, he's a pretty evil-seeming character, but he's also kind of like this fun pirate kind of character, and I enjoyed him a little bit. I wouldn't mind seeing more of that character too, but again, we can't have everything. But the Doctor gets shot and taken aboard one of the Peruvian ships, and essentially Stockwood and some of the other survivors are hanging out in this cave with some of the remaining islanders. There's not many left on the island, and everybody's very silent, and Stockwood feels very awkward and unhappy. And they bring in Jack and Jennifer Richards, and Topena, one of the islanders, explains how the Peruvians arrived, and they made the islanders, a bunch of them, sign a contract, which of course they couldn't read, to become slaves. And many were captured, and some tried to escape and were killed. And the fight's been going on for days, and hundreds of people have been killed. Not too good. Yeah, so we get the Doctor hanging out on the Peruvian ship, and the islanders are very angry and naturally hate the interlopers, so the Doctor has quite a bit of work to do to convince them that he's alright, and he means them no harm. But he's hauled on deck to meet the captain, Debrees, and he assumes the Doctor is a priest, and goes about as well as you might expect, with Debrees saying he'll convert these valueless men into valuable slave workers. And he takes the Doctor's diamonds, of course, locks them up again. Stockwood, Jack, and Richards, they're taken to a council of war among the people, and that's where they meet Leela. And it turns out she's been there for a while. And Royston's also there, tired and spent, but oddly happy. And he admires Leela quite a bit, and thinks she should have a term in politics. And yeah, so then we hear about how Leela and Royston survived and were rescued. But an old woman recognizes Stockwood and accuses him of treachery and theft, of stealing the Rongo Rongo, of course. And Torturo, their old island guide, was her brother. And his son, who Stockwood did indirectly save, is now dead, killed by the Peruvians. And this tall, white-haired man is led through the crowd, and I had a feeling who it would be, and indeed, it is Alex, who rasps, "I am your punishment!" And he steps toward Stockwood, arms outstretched, looking terrible. And the old woman, Athena, slits his throat as he repeats his mantra once again. And it's pretty terrible.
Yeah.
But after that, the islanders wash Stockwood in Alex's blood, and they seem to think that the punishment is over, and now things will be a little bit more peaceful, even though that's not the case for Jennifer at all. And she's in shock and unable to do anything much. And Leela now trusts the islanders to welcome and look after Stockwood. And Leela leads an attack on the Peruvian invaders. And they're getting drunk, so the timing's really good. And they take Tweed back and rescue Stuart. And we have another really awesome action sequence, which was another highlight for me. I enjoyed this part. This really chaotic fight on the ship with things falling over and catching fire and the magazine of the ship blowing up. And the doctor almost, who's all tied up, almost falling off the plank of the ship and drowning. And Leela has to save him, which she, of course, managed to do quite well. And Leela and Debray get to meet head-on in an inferno of the burning ship. And Debray falls overboard. And he's not dead, though, and we will see him at least one more time. But Leela, Stockwood, and Richards have a moment after Alex's death as well, and there's some pretty impassioned speech-making from Jennifer, who essentially laments her place in the world and the fact that she was left behind, and I guess she's kind of speaking for upper-class Victorian English ladies everywhere, and how they're not treated with respect by the men in their lives. And she makes some fair points, but I just kind of wish that there was a bit more, I guess. Because her character arc is not very satisfying for me, so I think that's probably the least strong part of the book, unfortunately. So they see the doctor is starting to understand the purpose of the monuments, and the Rongo Rongo has a translation for a chant that can be used to activate them. And it turns out that there's the old woman, Athena, believes that they can send Stockwood, who has been wounded, through the portal, and he can be saved. Because, as with transporters everywhere, the transporter will magically heal you of any damage that your body might have as it reconstructs you in another place. We don't get to all that quite in all that order, but we do eventually get to an alien planet, and yeah, this part really reminded me of Arthur C. Clarke. They're kind of wandering around this abandoned technological landscape and traveling between these different portals, and there's one world that's like it's a moon that used to be used for like manufacturing, and everything on it is dead, and like this dust everywhere, and the sun is strange, and there's a lot of really cool descriptions. And they end up in a city where there's all these anti-gravity things everywhere and floating bridges and stuff like that. And it's pretty cool. And again, very Arthur C. Clarke. So yeah, it turns out that the ancient aliens that built the monoliths were actually encoding their DNA into a part of the human race. And they had suffered a massive calamity due to a war situation and were almost completely wiped out. And so this was their attempt to basically spread their genes around. And Stockwood and Royston hear about all this, and they're really horrified because, yeah, I mean, it's kind of manipulation on a grand scale. And the Doctor kind of finds it really fascinating. And it's like, we're getting pretty close to the end of the book, and it turns out that, yeah, Jenny does make a last attempt on Stockwood's life because she just can't get over that. And I don't totally blame her again, but I don't know, it's just, yeah. The way that they ended was pretty tragic, and I kind of felt some of it, but it just, I don't know. It needed a bit more fleshing out, I think, and her character needed to be more than just. I can see why she's mad. Like, there needed to be a bit more to it than that, I think. So Stockwood eventually decides to stay behind on the island. They do encounter the Peruvians one last time, and Debray gets killed. And yeah, the order of the chapters towards the end is kind of unfortunate because the last chapter before the epilogue is like I said, a Jennifer point of view chapter, and it's the chapter where they last encounter Debray. And the thing is, we already know that Jennifer gets killed like soon afterwards. So, I don't know, like, again, all through the first part, I was really happy with the way he structured it. But during this part, yeah, the last quarter, not even the full second part, maybe, but the last quarter, I was starting to feel like the order should not be like this now. Because, yeah, like, chapter 29 is, I don't think anticlimactic is really the right word, but it's kind of like that. Like, it's just, it's not really, like, we've already seen a lot of this happen. We've already been to the alien planet and stuff. We already know what's going to happen to Jennifer. So having this close the book before the epilogue, which is actually a really nice epilogue. It closes the book very nicely, I think, where Stockwood is, now it's 30 years later in the early 1900s, and Stockwood is old, and Doctor and Leela have left with another expedition a long time ago, and the aliens have come back, and not many of the people remain on the island, and Stockwood will go too in the end. Yeah, I'm wondering, did the alien codes enter him too? I mean, I'm not sure. And you don't really know exactly what will happen in the future, and I think I do enjoy the ambiguity here of not knowing exactly how much this influence changes the people of the island, and it's not really clear, but I don't know that it really matters, because it's this really cool, mysterious way to do it. And I don't know, I appreciated there was some really cool, beautiful, kind of sentimental moments to close the book on, I think, with Stockwood, the old Stockwood. So, yeah, for the most part, I think this is a really good example of a Doctor Who book. And I definitely do agree that it does feel very Doctor Who in every way, because as well as what we were talking about, I think one thing Doctor Who often does is grab two seemingly disparate things from maybe two separate genres and just kind of mash them together and see what comes out. So here we got a sea voyage, we got Victorian London escapades, and we got a mysterious sci-fi Arthur C. Clarke-ish plot all mixed together.
Yeah, and I think overall it works. The Arthur C. Clarke stuff at the end, I think, does come in a little bit too fast and probably wraps itself up a little bit too quickly. Yeah. But aside from that, I thought this was really enjoyable, a lot of fun. He captures both Leela's voice and those scenes with her really well as the weird sea stuff, which I really like those kind of stories, especially since we've been doing them on the podcast.
Yeah, and earlier on, you heard the excerpt from the beginning of Chapter 8 from Leela's point of view, and that's an example of just how he does this. Music in the background is some of Mortimore's music as well. I did want to mention, he made some pretty cool music. It's available on his Bandcamp. You can download and listen to all kinds of stuff, and he has it for sale there, but you can listen to everything streaming for free. And it's really cool ambient music for the most part. He says he's really influenced by Tangerine Dream and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So, and I can definitely hear that. There's some pretty cool stuff there for sure. Some good ambient keyboard music. And been doing this for a while. I think the first recording on there is from 1986 or something like that, and that's like during the audio visuals days. So, yeah, I mean, if you're into that kind of synth exploration stuff, really long tracks of ambient floating soundscapes and stuff, and occasionally melody peeking through, you'll probably dig it. But I do want to quote what he said about the whale chapter. He said, "One day I'll publish the inane, desperate, and in no way offensive epic 7-page volume justifying keeping the Leela Rides the Whale chapter in. I think Steve Cole, former BBC Books editor, capitulated, not so much because of my perfect logic, but because I begged so embarrassingly. Come to think of it, that's probably the moment when I realized that, on the whole, it's much better to have your book cancelled than compromised." And yeah, I agree. I definitely would feel that way too. Even though a part of you would probably be tempted to be like, but I can get my book published. It's exciting to have a book published, right? And it's, you know, I mean, like we have already established, yes, there were quite a few writers in the tie-in world who were already established, but some of them were getting their feet in the door this way. And they would be willing to acquiesce to any restrictions. But I don't know, Mortimore, from what I see of his personality and from what other people have spoken about him, he does really seem like a person who wants to go his own way and is pretty adamant about it. And so occasionally he's sort of gone against the flow and sort of aggravated some of the editorial staff. And I think, maybe Big Finish, because he's never been asked to write another one apparently. And I don't know. It's just, I don't want to speculate too much because, these are matters that one can only kind of guess at this point, and the people involved are still around and still involved in their own capacity. So,
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed most of what I've read by him. I mean, I wouldn't say like necessarily everything always lands, but when it does, it lands really well. And I would definitely like to see, for example, that original novel that's completely unfettered from the restrictions of tie-in land. And see what he can really get away with. But
overall, I also really enjoyed this novel, and I definitely like to check out more of Mortimer, both the Doctor Who, like, tie-in stuff, and also the original work.
Yeah, definitely. So, now that we've kind of talked about all this stuff, I wonder, doing this changed any of you guys' perspectives on these kind of books? Gretchen, I know you've read quite a few, and Nate, you don't have a lot of experience with this.
No, not really.
Quote, trashy, quote, form of fiction. But what do you guys think about all this?
I don't know. I thought this was a fun little excursion. I don't know how much I'm going to be revisiting tie-in novels in the future. But yeah, I definitely have no complaints about either novel we covered for this time. And I think they were both fun little looks into TV shows that I really like.
And as someone who has read some tie-in stuff before, different tie-in novels, I've always had like a fondness for them, and I think this just is part of that. I don't think I have any changed opinion except just having 2 more tie-in novels under my belt that I really enjoyed, and look forward to reading more both of Doctor Who and Star Trek in the future.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously I used to read quite a few of these, and I don't think I really talked about this before, but when we were talking about the general tie-in experience at the beginning of the episode there, but I did read quite a few movie novelizations, and in a few cases it was before I saw the actual film. But, I mean, in general, I guess hearing all the accounts of a writer frustration in both the Star Trek and Doctor Who world kind of confirmed a bit of a suspicion or feeling that I've always had, that like it can be tricky territory to navigate, both for a writer and a reader, because as a reader you have to kind of find some happy medium between I really like Doctor Who and Star Trek, I want to read these books because I like that world so much, but I actually just want to read good books, right? Like I want to read good books, and if it's like some really long, they're setting up this like really long serialized arc of storytelling by a whole bunch of different authors, and you're like, I wish I could just read the good ones, but then at the same time I want to have the whole experience, right? And like, it's just a whole other way of going about things that I don't know, like I kind of, and then going back to what Jim just said earlier about feeling like it might be better to have your book canceled than compromised. I do get the feeling that a lot of books get compromised. And, especially like talking about the dark period of Star Trek fiction that I mentioned earlier, where it seemed like they couldn't step out of line even a little bit without somebody coming down on their heads being, no, you can't write that character like that. Just so infuriating. And at the same time, you can't really argue because you agreed to work in their sandbox. So,
And all those big franchises are all owned by massive, massive companies.
Yeah. So, and again, it does seem like when the property isn't being made for television or film anymore, that's when the book authors can really go to town and do some fun stuff. Because, yeah, the restrictions have definitely relaxed at the point where maybe somebody like the BBC or Paramount cares just enough to give out a license and to sell the license to people, but they don't really care enough to strongly oversee everything. And I guess, in a way, that's the ideal position. But the thing is, fans are always going to be like, oh, I want the show to come back, right? Or I want things to be back in the golden age. And, I remember, 2005, when Doctor Who was going to come back, I was really excited. And I guess maybe a part of me thought, oh, this might be the end of a golden period for fans too, though, because we might not see books that push the envelope anymore. We might not see audios that push the envelope anymore because they'll have to tread more carefully from here on out. And maybe during the first couple of seasons of Doctor Who, New Who, I didn't think about that too much, but those thoughts definitely started to come back when I realized I wasn't really as engaged with the show as I could possibly be, and started spending a lot of time wondering, well, is it me, or is the show just so different that I don't really connect with it in the way that I used to? And it's a combination of both things, for sure. I don't know, sometimes I want to like the new show more than I do, but I don't know. It's not terrible. I'm not going to sit here and complain about it. I'd like kind of what I was saying earlier. I think there is a point where you just kind of realize that things have moved on without you a little bit, and that's okay, because there's a lot of other stuff to get into as well. So I think not all fans of something like Doctor Who, Star Trek can be on board with every little aspect of those things, because it's pretty much impossible when they have such a long history and so many people are involved.
Yeah, you're sort of always going to kind of have to pick and choose the sort of aspects of these franchises that you most want to engage with.
Right. Something like Doctor Who or Star Trek now has literally thousands of novels and audio productions and comics, and there's no way to really be immersed in it all.
Yeah.
So I think that's why certain websites like the Doctor Who ratings guide are pretty helpful, because you can read other people's thoughts on the stuff, people who have kind of taken the time to get into a lot of this stuff and find out maybe where you might want to go.
Right.
It's easy to say, well, you should form your own opinion, but with thousands and thousands of titles to sift through, I think a little help is not to be scoffed at.
Especially if you want a one-off like these two have been, and you don't want to get involved in a 15-part serial or whatever.
Saga, yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking when we were planning this episode, and so I picked this book for that reason, because I think anybody who even likes Doctor Who just a bit could possibly get into this. And I think the same is true of the Star Trek book. Not only that, but the Star Trek book is the Star Trekiest of the Star Trek. So, so if you wanted to show somebody what Star Trek was like, and they didn't have access to the show, you could hand them that book. And I think with Eye of Heaven, it is a little bit similar in that, Doctor Who can be all these things that are in this book and more. So they're both pretty good representations in that sense, I think. So yeah, I don't know if we'll be revisiting this continuum again either. I suspect if we do, it'll be a while. But there are certainly other franchises we could also dip into. I would say even doing one or two very, very special movie novelizations might not be out of reach in the future. I don't really know which ones we could do, but I'll definitely do some poking around and see which might be of particular note for one reason or another. There might be some cool cross-media experiments too, where, it's kind of like you can't even be sure which came first in a sense, like the book or the movie. Like right. 2001 is the perfect example, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're talking about Arthur C. Clarke earlier. I actually did reread 2001 recently, and I had a pretty good time with it. Yeah, I had a pretty good time with the book, so I don't know if we'll want to do that, Clarke, but we'll definitely do one. But yeah, it's a nice, short, well-done book, and like what you were saying about the Clarke sci-fi stuff being taken care of pretty fast in this book, Eye of Heaven, it's true, but I do think it avoids perhaps some of the pitfalls that Clark can be sometimes accused of as well, where it's like, he gets too wrapped up in the technical side of things, and it gets a little bit dry, and like, I don't know, it's kind of chapters and chapters of describing how stuff works.
Yeah.
Now,
I don't mind him.
I don't mind because, Clark is, I think, actually really good at that.
Yeah.
I think he has a certain enthusiasm and passion that makes it like read like it's exciting to us, just like it is to him, kind of.
It's like the sci-fi equivalent of Melville and Moby Dick being like, look at all of these whale facts, and
right.
Yeah.
It being like very, very detailed, but also the enthusiasm makes it still very interesting.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I don't know if there's something special about him, because I definitely think that not all writers can do that. But I think that he has some kind of sense of grandeur. It's like that sense of wonder that you're supposed to have as a young science fiction fan, right? Or as somebody who's really getting interested in science, for example. It's like he still has it. And I almost feel like that weird friendship that we talked about once on the podcast before, where Clark and Lord Dunsany became friends. And like, it's hard to imagine two more opposite kind of British writers of fantastic / genre fiction, because Dunsany is all mysticism and like definitely more fantastical, not science-based, and Clark is the opposite. But Clark also has this sense of poetry, I think, to him, where he really is able to convey those kind of hard science concepts in a way that's beautiful. And I think that's probably one of the things that draws people like Jim Mortimer to his work, too. He's a little bit like a more hard science Ray Bradbury almost in that way, I think. But we'll be talking about him more some other time.
Yeah, definitely.
We don't have plans to do him anytime in the next several months, but maybe next year we'll get to something by him. But we do have plans for next month, though. We're all going to have our host choices. Nate and Gretchen both had their turn, and now it's my turn. So I have chosen Fritz Leiber and his Time War stories, or Change War as he liked to call it. And this is a series of one novel and a few interconnected somewhat, or at least somewhat interconnected short stories. And the novel is very short. You can probably read it in a few hours. It's called The Big Time. And there's actually a really good LibriVox version, surprisingly. I mean, well, I don't know. Maybe it's not that surprising, but it's kind of a luck of the draw depending on who you get to read the stuff. I know Nate and I, when we did Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon and then the follow-up, I listened to the audiobook of the follow-up, and I think Nate listened to some of it too, and it was rough going.
Yeah, there's some dismal stuff on LibriVox, but there's some really good stuff too. There's this woman, Mill Nicholson, who I might have mentioned before, who does some amazing readings of Dickens that are on par with any of the pros from like Blackstone Audio or
yeah,
whatever.
That's really cool. Yeah. The Big Time, as far as I know, it's still up there. I might have to check to see. There's actually an Audible version too, which I guess is a professional one, and I didn't like that one as much. The LibriVox one is read by Karen Savage, and if you just want to take 3 or 4 hours out of your day, you can listen to the novel on LibriVox for free. So I highly suggest that you do that, or in some way take in The Big Time, because it's a really cool book. But there's also some shorts connected with it, and they can be found in the book The Change War, and there's just a few of them. It starts with No Great Magic, then there's The Oldest Soldier, Night to Move, Damnation Morning, Try and Change the Past, and finally, A Deskful of Girls. And those pretty much make up the sequence. So we're going to be reading and talking about all those. And it seems like a lot of short stories, but some of them are very short, so it won't take very much time to read through all this stuff. If you can find it, I definitely highly recommend it. It's pretty cool. And yeah, back in the day, the Big Time did win the Hugo Award. I know there's a lot of controversy around the Hugo Awards right now. Maybe not the best time to mention them, but this was 1958, so I don't know. Whatever. It I think deserves it. It's this pretty humble book in a way, and just the way it's told, and the scale of it is simultaneously really small and large, because it tells a tale about a war through time, but it's from the perspective of a very small set of rooms and a very small group of people and how they interact with each other. So the whole book could be a stage play, really. And I think that's what makes it pretty cool. One of the things that makes it pretty cool. So it's kind of a locked room mystery, almost. And I think you guys will probably enjoy it. I know I do.
Definitely looking forward to it. I've been wanting to get to a library work at some point.
Yeah, I've only read a couple of his shorts, so definitely looking forward to getting on to a longer work.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's going to be really cool, guys. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to next month. And yeah, by then it'll be springtime.
Yeah.
So it's warming up here already quite a lot. So
yeah, same here.
Well, after all that, I believe my flux capacitors in the engine room are just about burned out, and we won't be able to achieve more capacity for a while yet. So I'm going to find my sonic screwdriver. So now, we have been Chrononauts, and we hope you've enjoyed our exploration of the prose versions of some of our favorite televisual adventures. And we bid you good night. Bye for now.